We are meeting at a time when there's kind of an international reality show underway, except it's happening in real time. I'm talking about Edward Snowden on the run. And not only here in this room, but this is a situation where the whole world literally is rooting for him. I mean, there are billions of people who are watching this, who are hooked to this. And you have the U.S. government making dire threats on China and then Russia, and how dare Ecuador, we can squeeze you, we can cut off your trade, threats on Cuba, don't you dare receive him, and so on and so forth. And it's important to recognize that the whole world is very much enjoying at this point thumbing their nose at an absolutely arrogant superpower. And there's outrage at the revelations, something we all know well, but of every phone call, every email, every cable, every possible transaction in the hands of a government that is making war on the world. Now, you'd wonder how that connects to tonight's meeting, and why, when you look at the rage, for example, of WikiLeaks and its revelations. Now, just a couple of years ago, the Washington Post, actually April 18th, 2011, wrote a rather detailed article on the U.S. funding of the Syrian opposition, and it was based on WikiLeaks cables from April of 2009. So that really shows this goes back a little ways before even the outbreak of the military struggle underway, that the support and the plan for building an opposition with U.S. funds was very much in place long before.
I'm happy and excited to be among all of you. It's really a pleasure. We've been working in trying to stop the U.S. government from supporting the rebels for a while, and now we're happy to see that we have friends that we can join hands together and we can hopefully get somewhere together. Thank you. We think that the administration decision to arm the rebel is really short-sighted, but why? The first reason, and probably the most important reason, the rebels on the ground are not the people that you can trust. The American government speaks about some moderate and some extremists. On the ground, we don't see anybody except the extremists. Maybe those moderates are those people that sit in hotels in Turkey and somewhere else. Nevertheless, on the ground, we only see extremists that kill, and we only see the Islamists appearing in here and in there that think of Islam as a way of using a religion to get themselves into power. They don't have anything to do with Islam whatsoever, because Islam is way nicer than this and way peaceful, more peaceful, and most importantly, they don't allow killing like this. From the other point of view, from the American point of view, from the start, the American government was helping the rebels. And like Sarah said, from 2009, they started thinking and supporting people to topple the regime in Syria. Now, they could think about toppling a regime, although it's internationally illegal, but nevertheless, they're doing it with weapons, and that's definitely wrong, and that's what we're trying to stop, because it's not about who's in charge in there. What we want is to stop the killing. War is never a solution. On the other hand, what we see on the ground, that the government forces are gaining ground, and unfortunately, our warmongers in here, they think that this is probably a victory for Iran and Russia, and this is why they are all up in arms, and they want to arm people to try to do something about it, and that's even worse. In conclusion, we don't think that the public announcement that the United States is involving themselves in the conflict in there is something new, but we think and we know that they know very well that their friends are not about to win. We know that they're arming their friends so they would last more, so there will be more destruction for Syrian infrastructure and society in general. On the other hand, what would the Israeli attack or the role of the Israelis in the conflict? We see that the armed rebels are concentrating on on targets that the Israelis are concentrating on, and namely the air defense of the Syrian army, namely the airports, the long-range missiles, the depots of weapons, and communication centers. And on the other hand, the Israelis takes fighters that are wounded, they go and treat them and bring them back. And the statements of the Israeli government's always in conflict. They want the Assad sometimes, they want the rebels sometimes. All of it speaks highly that they are involved, they want the destruction of Syria, and that's again what we're trying to stop. Even the call for no-fly zone from our esteemed government, obviously it's not the answer. And obviously if they were able to do it, they would have done it from before. Obviously there is some power to the Syrian army, and there will be some obstacles and there will be some blood. And obviously we don't want that. And obviously there is some international uprisings going somewhere that hopefully we can build on it so we can stop this ugly war. Now, is the recent announcement a prelude for action from the United States government? We have a lot of reason to think that the American government is not ready to go involved itself militarily in Syria. But we have to qualify that by saying so far. Nevertheless, the decision to announce it in the open, the decision to plan for a no-fly zone, the training of the armed elements in the neighbors of countries, and the continued provision of communication equipment or the non-lethal equipment, all of it speaks highly that this is a prelude, and probably they are ready when time comes that they're going to go, whenever they feel that Israel's security is at stake, they will go and involve themselves. Let me say by the end that we think that the awareness of the American public is the most important thing. And we all have to work together to make everybody understand that we think as the American public, we can stop this agony. We should stop the administration from dragging us to this meaningless set of wars. Now I'm going to take you for a few slides to show you, since I am a doctor and I'm a physician that graduated from the University of Damascus in Syria, and I have some background about the way things were then and the way they are now. The healthcare in Syria prior to the sanction was definitely a very strong system. First, all education were free. I became a doctor for 7 years in college and in medical school. I paid maybe $100 in total. And it's not a mediocre kind of doctor. I am an assistant professor in cardiology in the New Jersey State College in Newark and in Seton Hall University. I'm a teacher, and in the state of New Jersey, we have 900 physicians that are graduate from the University of Damascus, and all of it for free. We have dentistry, nursing, pharmacists, all of them are educated for free. All of medical care is free, and it's public, available for everybody. There are centers, the government made sure that every 10,000 person, they will have a center that have a doctor and a nurse and a little urology center in every little village. In addition, cancer treatment is free for all, diabetes treatment is free for all, TB treatment is free for all. It's available everywhere until recently, obviously. This is to give you an idea about where are we in numbers. In Syria, for every 10,000 person, we have 15 physicians, 7 dentists, 8.4 pharmacists. You can read the numbers. 15 beds, like I said, a center for every 10,000. And these are statistics from the Ministry of Health. As compared to our statistics, and that's in 2010 in Syria, our statistics in 2010, in the United States, we have a doctor for every 17 to 29 people in the most richest country in the world. So they were doing something good. Is it only numbers? No, the health indicators are very, very interesting. The life expectancy is about 73 years, and that's in 2010. The newborn birth with weight less than 2.5 is 9.2. That's comparable to everywhere on Earth even. The deliveries attended by trained personnel is 96%. Infant attended by trained personnel at birth is 96%. It's comparable to United States and probably a little better. That's a schematic to show you the mortality of children less than 5 years old. From 1970 to 2009, the mortality dropped about 600%. Same thing, infant mortality at birth. And again, it dropped tremendously. And probably the interesting number is this number, and that's probably the most commonly used indicator of the health of health care in a country, is the mortality of the mother at birth per 100,000 mother. It started about 500 in 1970. In 2009, it was 52. I can tell you my experience here in Jersey City, where I practice, we have more than 150 in here in the United States. So they reached a level that is really admirable. This is the life expectancy, went up about 20 years from 1970 till now. Now what happened? What happened after the sanction? And that's again, all of those numbers are from the World Health Organization. Okay, now with what's happening now, we have about 20% of the hospitals are partially damaged. We have 37 disabled. We have reduced capability because lack of fuel, there is no electricity, and there is no way to repair those hospitals for now. There is an increased demand on the hospitals, obviously, because people are moved from one area to the other because of the conflict and what's happening. In Latakia, that's a city in northern Syria, there is a visit in the emergency department every 32 seconds. Some rooms are used as shelters, obviously, because of lack of houses now. The workforce, about 70% in major cities, for 70% of workers live in rural areas, like in New York and the around area. And the traveling is becoming really a problem because sanction does not allow you to get cars, and obviously there's no fuel, security, it's a problem. And most important, the snipers that our beloved rebels are doing, they sit on a roadway and they sniper one or two people, and then the road is blocked because everybody is going to be scared. So they're not reaching the hospital, and people are traveling around. Physicians, plenty of them fled, but most importantly, even the people that did not flee, and this is an example in Aleppo, from 5,000 private physicians, only 36 are still practicing now. But like I said, more importantly than the leaving is that the system is broken. Now the system of referral, that you saw your primary doctor, you want to be referred to a gynecologist, you want to see a cardiologist, you have a cancer, you want to continue treatment, all of that is broken and it's disrupted. And important stuff in here, that the ambulances are damaged, and unfortunately they're not able to get the ambulances to be, because of the sanction. The pharmaceutical issue is rather interesting. Prior to 2011, prior to March, prior to the sanction, the Syrian government managed to have 90% of the needed medication produced internally. They had plenty of them bought as a bulk, and then they were able to make them in pills, and they were able to manage with that. And the medication were really reasonable in price. Everything was working wonderfully. Now, only 10% of those factories are available. What happened to them? Plenty of them were damaged, but more importantly, a big portion were stolen. They take the factory, all of it, to Turkey because the regime is bad. Can you imagine that because of a regime, you need to take a factory of medication from one country to the other? Critical shortage of all medication, including painkillers, antibiotic, diabetic medications. Another very interesting picture is the sanitation. And again, that's probably a medal on their chest, that they were able to manage initially to get 75 gallons per person per day of clean water. And that's not available in the United States. Definitely not available in more than 70% of the countries in the world. But with this critical stuff now they drop to 25 gallons. Now, when they drop to 25 gallons, you're not able to collect garbage. And the toilets in those, collective accommodation, what happens is when people are, kicked out of their homes, the government will have some collective, accommodation area, like in arenas or in dorms for universities and stuff. But now you have a lot more people than the capacity planned for. And now you have more than 50 to 70 people for one toilet. So if they're not able to reach the toilet and there is no clean water and the garbage is not collected, you're going to expect what we're going to see. That's the garbage that you can see now. You have in Syria registered 430 diabetic. Out of that is 40,000 in children. They're not able to get insulin. The problem is that even when they get the insulin, they're not able to keep it refrigerated to reach the children. The refrigerator, you're not allowed to send them refrigerator, you're not able to send them money because of the sanction. In Raqqa, which was a big hospital that the World Health Organization is talking about, they were a center for cancer and for hemodialysis, but they were overwhelmed because all the hospitals next to them closed and people moved to them. So in the day that in a center in the United States, you get for every bed about 6 or 7 hemodialysis patients, and there they have about 40 for every bed. So they started stretching them more, and obviously this is critical. And obviously I cannot say, okay, this is $40,000, I'm going to send you a machine. There is a sanction, you're not supposed to send them machines. And by the end, there is an early warning system for disease outbreak in Syria. In 2013, that's the first week of June, you have a watery diarrhea that was 240. In the third week of the same month, in 2 weeks, they reported 600. There is a 172% increase of diarrhea only in 2 weeks. The same period of time, hepatitis A, was reported 48 and 153. It's about 200%. So this is the start, and that's in June of 2013. So now you know that there is a real issue, there is a real problem by numbers, and that's World Health Organization. Leishmania is a parasite that the vector to take it from one place to the other is called the sand bug. And it was endemic in an area in Syria. They had all the control on it, and they can inject the medication in the sewer and everything will be fine. Now because every place, people went every other place, now it's spreading all over. They don't have the usual protection that they have, those insecticide-treated nets, bed nets, that they put on people so those parasites don't move to another person. Now it's spreading all over, and it's reaching even the countries nearby. Measles, it's an interesting problem. The vaccination prior to 2010 was about 95%, 2010, 2011. Now again, no refrigeration, no what they call a cold chain of command for the vaccination. It's not available anymore. So it's only 45% vaccinated now. And now in 2010, 2011, no reported cases. Now we have 139. 77% of those reported were not vaccinated.
The U.S. is financing this war to save the people of Syria, and the people of Syria are the first and most extreme casualties of it. And I think that your presentation really brought that home. This is not a civil war. It's certainly not a revolutionary struggle. It's a counter-revolution. The fighters are proxies and foot soldiers for world imperialism and for Israel. And for those in the U.S. who are against Assad, particularly now, you need to look at either side and see who you are lined up with. On one side, you'll see the Pentagon. On the other side, Israel. And behind you are the original colonial oppressors in the Middle East. The goal is the dismemberment of Syria and destruction of its territorial integrity and its culture and economy, and to destroy the anti-imperialist alliance that Syria has with Iran and with Hezbollah in order to maintain independence and to pick them off one by one. U.S. and its NATO allies and regional clients are using the Arab Spring, truly a mass and inspirational outpouring, but without a unified leadership, as a cover for a sea change in the Middle East, to destroy any states with independence and recarve the area for their own purposes. to redraw the map of the Middle East as it did in the secret Sykes-Picot Treaty during World War I, to have more direct access to the natural resources of the Middle East and give nothing to the people. Already in a weakened Iraq, instead of even going to their puppet Iraqi government for oil, they're going directly to Kurdistan because they can get a better deal directly from Kurdistan than from their own government. So that's what they want to do. There's no functioning government in Libya, but the oil keeps getting pumped out. And they want to do the same thing in Syria. Destroy it as a state. That's my view. Who is Bashar Assad? Are the legitimate grievances against him? I think there's much confusion in the U.S. movement here. Certainly he's not a revolutionary. But one thing he has done, he's kept Syria together, and his family have kept Syria together. This is not a Sunni versus Shia area of the world. It's a mosaic. There are about 20 different religious, ethnic, and cultural groups in Syria. And there's a whole network of ways that the wheels are greased socially and culturally. Maybe not perfectly, but there's a lot of pride in this, in the Levant area. Now, the fighting is seeking to destroy all that. People are being killed by identity and religion. The suspicion is being created, and there are population shifts due to it. Assad has protected the Palestinians. The Palestinians in the camp of Syria are treated the best in any of the frontline states. He has allowed the more radical Palestinian groups and Hamas to have headquarters in Damascus. He stands up against Syria, against Israel, and there's still a state of war with Israel. And Syria demands the return of the Golan Heights. But there are legitimate grievances against Assad. There's repression, and there have been, in any country where one family has ruled for 40 years, there's going to be legitimate grievances. But the main thing is that in 2005, Syria went along with the IMF and World Bank neoliberal policies and sold off a lot of the state-run enterprises. Cronies of Assad, the Assad family, grew rich, and others did. Many were Sunni, and tens of thousands were laid off. There was even though conditions remained very good, there was a breaking of the social contract, and a lot of the opposition to Assad was based on that. But that's not why the imperialists dislike him. They like him for that, because he followed their instructions. He eroded his base, and they went right in. That's what happened. There's two sides on this. Now, who's the opposition? The opposition, the leadership has always been from the outside. Calling the shots have been people long allied with the West. It's been repeatedly said in the press that they're hopelessly divided, fighting among themselves for booty. For instance, in December 2011, Burhan Balyoun, a leader of the Syrian National Council at the time, told the Wall Street Journal that he would open up Syria to the West, end Syria's strategic relations with Iran and with the Lebanese and Palestinian resistance, and really Syria with the Gulf regimes, those bastions of democracy. The head of the Syrian National Coalition right now, the opposition to Assad, is an American, Ghassan Hito. Not even a Syrian, he's an American. The opposition has no political program, no real goals. They rely on the Takfiri groups, al-Nusra in Syria, who are the most effective fighting force. Takfiri, these are unpredictable, way of fringe religious groups that come out of the despair of the area, then they're financed by the U.S. Many started in Iraq under the U.S. occupation. They did not exist there under Saddam Hussein. According to Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, These are Sunni groups that accuse other groups of apostasy, which to them is punishable by death. In Iraq, he said they have killed Shias and Sunnis, blown up mosques and churches, killed tribal elders, killed people lining up to vote, which is considered apostasy, between 4,000 and 5,000 suicide bombers on a religious basis. They exist in Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Somalia, and now Syria. They also kill Sunnis who don't agree with them. This is not a Shia versus Sunni thing. Another name for them would be death squads. So how did they get in Syria? In 2005, the U.S. withdrew its ambassador, but Syrians put in these economic neoliberal policies. So the ambassador came back in 2011. They sent John Ford. Now, John Ford studied under Negroponte in Iraq, the ambassador. People remember Negroponte from the 80s? He set up the death squads in El Salvador. Well, many feel that he is responsible for the beginning of these Takfiri groups in Iraq. And John Ford was his acolyte. 2 months after Ford came into office in Syria, the fighting started. He's no longer ambassador there, but he continues to direct the U.S. aspect of that campaign from Washington. He made a secret visit to Syria last month as part of that effort. So the U.S. has it both ways. They say they hate Assad and they hate al-Nusra, but they're pushing al-Nusra. They're behind al-Nusra. They've resurrected groups like this. They use racism and anti-Islam bigotry as their weapon. The imperialists then try to lump all religious forces in the Middle East together. But the truth is that they hate it when anti-imperialists fight in the name of religion, like the Iranian Revolution, like Hezbollah in Lebanon. But they work very hard to foment and finance oppressed peoples and workers fighting each other in the name of religion. And the imperialists try to make this happen as much as they can. And because then they can say it's entirely something else over here and they can fool us. We must not be fooled by this, nor by the racist war against Islam, a religion of the oppressed, being waged by the U.S. government right here at home as well as abroad. Now, the real reason I think that the U.S. is upping the ante, that it's giving small arms web, that's talking about no-fly zone, is that it's really lost on the ground. The major battles in the border areas with Lebanon have been pretty decisive. The fighting continues, but the so-called rebels have all but lost. So the U.S. is Now, the media says it's because of Hezbollah. Well, Hezbollah has maybe 1,000, maybe 2,000 fighters. It's a small group in a small country. But this could not have happened without support from the Assad government among the Syrian people. According to information collected by NATO and published May 31st by Middle East Newsline, which is a subscription newsline which specializes in military-related developments in the Middle East, 70% of Syrians support the Assad regime, another 20% were neutral, and the remaining 10% expressed support for the rebels. This was a compilation by NATO of data from humanitarian workers in and around Syria, Western humanitarian workers in and around Syria. Quote, "The Sunnis have no love for Assad, but the great majority of the community is withdrawing from the revolt. What is left of the foreign forces who are sponsored by Qatar and Saudi Arabia? They are seen by the Sunnis as far worse than Assad." Syrian Sunnis are likely disgusted by the behavior of the foreign extremists, which include a laundry list of war crimes, ethnic cleansing, as well as the terrorist bombing of a Sunni mosque that killed the top Sunni cleric in Syria. And there's a list of other examples. We don't see this poll in the Western press or any other ones like it. So the U.S. escalation is really going against the will of the Syrian people at this point. Also, a poll by Pew Research Center said that 65% of the population here opposes U.S. assistance or intervention of any kind in Syria. So the U.S. government is going against the will of the people here in these escalation moves. It says it's bringing democracy, but it doesn't respect the will of the people here or in Syria. So what's the problem? My view is that the problem is capitalism. The problem is a system which is so enamored with profits above people, above the environment, that the capitalists will sell their own mother for a profit. They are so short-sighted in their push for profits that they'll sell you the rope to hang them with if they can get enough money for it. It's a sick system. It's a system that produces great amount of goods, but when they can't sell them as a profit, they refuse to give them away, and people are left without jobs, and they're hungry, and they have no homes. And in order to continue making profits, they have wars, and they destroy the means of production so they can rebuild them and make profits. And that's what imperialism is. And that war drive is built into the system, and it cannot be reformed, and it must be destroyed. The demonization of Assad, of Islam, the view that there are no good guys in this situation, leads to indifference. Yet every imperialist victory hurts us here. It only emboldens the capitalists because it's two faces of the same system. The increase in technology has led to the ability to wage many imperialist wars at the same time. That was not true in the Vietnam era. So there's Afghanistan, there's Iraq, there's Syria, and now there's threats to Venezuela, and there's threats to Ecuador as well. We need to up the ante of the political consciousness in the anti-war movement to meet this situation. We need an anti-war movement that is thoroughly anti-imperialist and identifies it as the main enemy of humanity and defends unconditionally all the peoples and governments that it attacks.
I'm going to speak about sanctions now, particularly one institution and how the sanctions have affected it. You know, it's a pity that it's only when we have bombs and bloody body parts and missiles and rifles and masked gunmen and snipers that we get to know a country. And even then, we don't know it. We see really the superficial. Yes, there's blood. Yes, it's ugly. Yes, there's death. Yes, houses collapse and people flee. But underneath that, there is a more serious, I believe, devastation going on, which I believe our American government is quite efficient at implementing, and I want to talk about that. Poison gas, foreign fighters, sectarian massacres, 90,000 dead, no-fly zones. These frightening, unhelpful, and wearying words define Syria today. So let's take time for another drama. Syrian TV serials. Now don't laugh, please. Yes, the topic may seem inconsequential and out of place in a nation engulfed in violent conflict, but the subject is not too trivial for U.S.-designed sanctions against its latest Arab enemy. Since 2012, Syrian TV has been dumped off the satellite Hotbird and U.S. allies in the Gulf states who co-sponsored, transmitted, and once celebrated, enjoyed Syrian TV dramas, already withdrew their support and infrastructure for international distribution of Syrian TV programs. Now, why would they do that? The wider public, people who really know little about Syria except for conflict-related news during these 2 years, are told that Syrian opinion is controlled by state media and free speech is prohibited there. It is difficult to talk freely in the country on a range of subjects, but much and most of what people are concerned with can be discussed and can be created through art and literature. So what could emanate, given that we are told that there is such severe censorship, what could emanate from that so-called brutal dictatorship that could be of any value to cause TV dramas to be embargoed and a valued industry crushed? Anyone familiar with the high quality and public issues Syrian television producers address will understand. In the last 12 or 15 years, Syria rose to become a major quality and influential source of original TV drama. Their productions captivated the entire Arab-speaking world, even eclipsing Egypt, whose highly popular dramas had hitherto prevailed. What Syrian dramas, most of which were produced privately within the country, offered is best illustrated by two recent productions, and you can Google these. It's very easy to Google them in English. One, Bab al-Hara, produced in 2006, and the other, Malakat Aymanakum, produced in 2010. The first is a colonial period drama typical of the fine historical productions Syria excelled in. Some, like Bab al-Hara, are 20th century. Others are set in much earlier periods of Arab history. And I believe, in general, Syria had remained the main source for historical Arabic productions, akin to what you might find from Britain. You know that in the English language, Britain excels in its 17th, 18th, 19th century dramas. Syria has that place in the Arab world and in Arab history or culture. People hold a deep significance across the Arab world. These dramas hold a deep significance across the Arab world through their portrayals and their reflections of cultural values and historical events. Mamalakat, by contrast to Bab al-Hara, explores contemporary social concerns. And I think this one you may relate to very well if you have a chance to view it, although I think it's not yet translated into any language other than, it's not translated to a foreign language. Those issues are religious fanaticism, homosexuality, and the abuse of women. Written by a Syrian woman, the author and presenter Hala Diab, D-I-Y-A-B. You can again find out about her easily. It was produced by her compatriot, the highly regarded director Najdat Mansour, and again you can find out about him through Wikipedia. The work of these brilliant Syrian artists is known across the Arab world. The Arab public also recognizes that few can match Syrian productions in their historical accuracy, their readiness to address the subjects noted, as well as Palestinian aspirations and rights. Now, one thing I just want to mention, I viewed only one Syrian production focusing on the Palestinian struggle, where, believe it or not, the Israelis are the bad guys. I mean, you would never see this anywhere in Europe, or certainly not in America. And the focus of the film I watched was the Israeli military, actually. You know, they're gruff, they're corrupt, they're crude, they're masochistic, they're really disagreeable people. And those are played, by the way, by Syrians who have learned Hebrew in Syria. to take up those positions, you know, in the films. Then there is the issue in terms of TV dramas from Syria of authenticity. Syria is known to have the highest standards in the region in historical research applied to the arts and in Arabic language. And until this war began, Syria, you may know, was the primary country that people from all the world traveled to study Arabic. And they had developed their Arabic language institutions to an extent where they were doing very, very well in terms of their methodologies, and they were attracting, and therefore it was like another part of the economy that was being stimulated by the arrival of 2,000 or 3,000 that I knew of when I was there, mainly young people studying Arabic. Besides the technical, literary, and entertainment value of the stories of these dramas, Syria's TV dramas represented a fading political consciousness, that is, Arab nationalistic ideals. Many productions invoked a regional pride hard to find elsewhere. This was not unplanned. This was part of the government strategy and the government ideology, the sense of pride in culture which Syria, especially after the demise of Iraq as a center of cultural, linguistic, historical research, Syria maintained. And this, I believe, is one of the aims also of the American desire to destroy Syria. This is the last Arab state that is really so committed to Arab values and history and the language. Despite its low-quality news coverage and the stifling of political dissent and dialogue in Syria, through TV dramas, the country helped celebrate and sustain Arab national sentiment and secular values. You can see this for yourself on YouTube. You can just Google Syria TV dramas, or those two sources I gave, or the authors I mentioned. Meanwhile, by means of censorship by the West and its Gulf allies, the embargo against Syria has all but destroyed this institution, an institution loved and needed by Arab-speaking people worldwide. Whereas Syria produced 25 series for distribution internationally in 2011, producers were able to sell only one outside the country the following year, within months of U.S. and European and Arab embargo. The industry essentially collapsed due to outside design. Now, as Dr. Gias told you, the health system is, or the people are leaving because of the war and because of the difficulty of life. In this case, health professionals. But, as he said, the system is broken. So the conflict in Syria itself poses new obstacles to production of regular programming in the country. Thousands of Syria's most talented people and liberal thinking ones, from actors to musicians, writers, are out of work. Many have fled in search of employment in the Gulf states, while others have joined the opposition or are just sitting jobless. This is one of the many industries shattered by conflict, but the U.S. and its friends had a special reason to attack something as apparently benign as Syrian TV dramas. Investment in production, in part from the Gulf states, was stopped. More important, the networks in Saudi Arabia and Dubai, the major distributors, ceased carrying Syrian productions. And finally, area satellite carriers. The Arab League ordered Hotbird, Nilesat, and Arabsat to stop carrying Syrian media, including Syrian TV and Syrian drama TV. Of course, this has significant economic effects on Syria, but to me, as I've noted, the real aim is the cultural and ideological role of Syria in the region. One of the last remaining centers of Arab culture with a government committed to promoting Arab nationalist pride must be destroyed. It is undertaken willfully and strategically by the U.S. and its allies in their aim to destroy Arab nationalist values and the place of Syria in this. Syrian dramas, I note, have been replaced now by an alternative in the media industry, Turkish TV dramas, translated into Arabic, among other languages. And with that, you have different themes. You do not have those historical themes. You do not have the addressing religious fanaticism or extremism, as the Syrians did. Now you have romances and family conflict. It helps the Turkish economy and keeps the public distracted or in a stupor, while the war keeps their private lives in turmoil. And just in finishing, I want to urge you to, I'm glad Dr. Moose talked about the institutions, the health institutions that were available in the country. This, I'm sure he'll agree, will apply to education across the board, to research, to the development of dictionaries, to almost any institution you can think of. And the development of food, the distribution of food, the testing, etc., water, purification, all of this, I think we need to know how Syria developed in the last 20 years in particular, and what an extraordinary achievement it was, given that there were already sanctions against it, and given with those sanctions that the IMF and the World Bank would not offer Syria any loans at all. They got investments from elsewhere, but it was through their own energy and initiative and through Syrians returning from other parts of the world and investing in the country that it reached the economic level it had. And in the 22 years that I was visiting Syria, sometimes every 3 years or so, it's quite extraordinary. And I hope in future gatherings that you'll try to bring people or bring information about the Syrian economy and what they managed to achieve.
Take us back 100 years ago, the end of World War I. It was the British and French Empire, the British and French imperialists, who really divided the Arab world, the entire Middle East. A secret treaty at the time, revealed before the days of WikiLeaks, actually a treaty revealed by the Russian Revolution. It was called the Sykes-Picot Treaty. And what's happening today, you could say at a later time, just before the end of World War II, the dividing of Syria. So it's always happened by outside big powers coming into the region to carve it up in their own interests, not in the interests of the people. And it's a ruthless process. And part of what is going on today is really, again, a redivide of the region, an attempt to do so on a brutal sectarian ground, and on the basis of trying to destroy any of the governments that had an independent policy that had benefited the people. The war today in Syria is extremely dangerous and could become much more so. Could become more dangerous because U.S. policy has suffered an enormous setback. I mean, really, in every way, they're losing. The very force they have created has been unable to have even a paper unity, unable to even be in the same room together or reach any kind of agreement, unable to have a unified military command, and unable to stand up to a very well-organized Syrian resistance. And they're collapsing on every side. But the threat of a no-fly zone The threat of deeper U.S. intervention is very real. And it really is an acid test for this movement in this country right now. Because in a war, everyone is forced to take sides. And that is what is at stake today. We can't forget what the U.S. did in Iraq. A quarter of the population ended up dead, disabled, or dislocated. That is a horrendous toll. And what it meant to the culture and the people of Iraq, what a crime against humanity on every level. When you see what was done to Libya, where really a no-fly zone meant massive bombardment and destruction of every city in Libya, and the U.S. simply taking hold of $100 billion of Libyan reserves that were to be the basis of a African currency, a currency for all of Africa. And immediately after the assassination of Gaddafi, there was the announcement of AFRICOM, U.S. troops in 35 countries in Africa. So there's a lot at stake. And of course, U.S. corporate power that benefits so fabulously from war and militarism, huge profits, super profits, they never fight in their own name or in their own stated interests. It's always an effort to mobilize a population here by completely demonizing a leader, someone whose name was totally unknown to the population here, can suddenly become a face of evil incarnate. Media is very powerful. And the corporate media really acts as an arm of corporate power and military power to make it palpable. They appeal to humanitarian sentiments and raw fear. It's ABC. This is something I think everyone here knows. But it's always good to step back and repeat it again on a new war, because somehow it gets forgotten in the barrage of propaganda. Now these wars are always through vague alliances that are referred, which take it off of the U.S. You know, it's NATO. That's simply U.S. military commanded alliance of the big imperial powers, those former colonial powers, or a UN flag, such as was used in Iraq, Libya, today still in Afghanistan, earlier in Korea, where there's still U.S. troops more than 60 years later. They use proxies, the very states created and held together by U.S. power, where there's a thin, privileged layer whose wealth is totally dependent on U.S. weapons and used against their own people. And I want to talk a little bit about some of these proxies, because it's important. You know, for 2 years now, the U.S. has claimed in all the media that they're not arming the Syrian opposition. They said $60 million in some night vision goggles. Is there anyone here that believes that? The arms just happen to be coming through Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Now, Qatar is completely a U.S. creation. 94% of the population aren't citizens. They have no rights whatsoever. That means to health care, to schools, to vote, to anything. They're immigrant workers. There's a military, a U.S. creation, armed and trained, of only 10,000. It's really a huge air force, and there's a big air base, which Qatar volunteered to pay for the U.S. air bases in Qatar. It's a command center for the entire region. Does anyone think that any of the population of Qatar volunteered for such a thing? And of course, the arms flooding into Syria paid by this tiny Qatar monarchy. The same thing in Saudi Arabia, a tiny thin layer. The entire country named after the Saud royal family. No representation whatsoever. And as the speakers pointed out, the pipeline that Iran is building is very much a target of all this. How to break up any economic cooperation in the region is very much the purpose of these proxies flooding arms into Syria. Now, we could look at the role of Turkey, more than 60 years a member of NATO. There are 24 NATO bases in Turkey. That's not a small footprint. It's huge. And yet, it's important to recognize that it was millions of people in the streets in 2003 that forced the government to refuse to allow Turkish bases, NATO bases, to be used in Turkey in the invasion of Iraq. So sometimes the people can play a big role. We should keep that in mind today in these huge demonstrations taking place in Turkey. We should keep in mind the huge outpourings, millions in Turkey, against Israel at the time of the Mavi Marmara. In 2006 and in 2009, people played a big role. So all is not set. And we should always keep that in mind. A lot of this is meant to break up even the relations Turkey had very favorable, very good economic, political, diplomatic relations with Syria, with Iran, with Lebanon, until the beginning of this war. And that's what also imperialism wants to break up. They want to break up any ability of the people of the region to trade and exchange with each other. All must go through Washington and Wall Street. That's the determination. We could look at the role of the sanctions, the embargo, which break up the economic relations in the entire region. And in this, what's called the Arab League, that's really, again, it's the monarchies, the Gulf states. Now, I'm glad one of the speakers referred to Ambassador Ford, U.S. Ambassador. His role, aid to Negroponte, his role in setting up the death squads, U.S. role in El Salvador, in Iraq. Negroponte is truly a man with blood on his hands. When they say there can't be any diplomatic discussion with anyone with blood on their hands, well, we should ask them, who on earth is Ambassador Ford? Now, if the anti-war movement will be a serious force in the U.S. today, and it was a powerful force at the time of the U.S. war on Iraq, then it has to take sides. It has to take a firm stand against the war and against the efforts to use the worst forms of sectarian division. This is really armed and organized and orchestrated from Langley, Virginia, from the CIA. Overwhelmingly. It's not part of the culture in Syria. It was not part of the culture in Iraq. We look at the horrendous toll in Afghanistan. You would think things couldn't have gotten worse. But the U.S. occupation, invasion and occupation, there hasn't been a moment of peace or of development. All the plans that there would be a new Marshall Plan, did any of that happen? Weapons alone don't decide history. Today, there are more weapons held by the U.S. The military budget is larger than the whole rest of the world put together. But this government is an empire in serious decline and decay. And they learned the hard way in Vietnam, in Iraq, and now in Afghanistan. They're handing Bagram Air Base back to Afghanistan. Why is that? It's no longer secure. There's not one part of it, including the prison at Bagram, that is safe area. Every day there's a new attack. This is something that Israel, with all of its weapons, seen just a generation ago as the force that allowed the U.S. not to be in the region. The Israelis did it for them, made war on the entire region. And yet they couldn't hold 10 feet of Lebanese territory in 2006. That's a fact. Nor have they been able to defeat tiny, encircled Gaza. That's incredible. The people of Gaza built 1,000 tunnels to bring in food and supplies. So there is an enormous capacity of people to resist. And this is what we need to see and be aware of today. That U.S. wars are terrible. They take a terrible toll here, and especially on the countries that are targeted. But they have been resisted.
In the USA, the land of mass incarceration, the Supreme Court struck down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act that so many black people and their allies fought and died for. The Federal Bureau of Prisons has denied compassionate release to our hero Lynn Stewart, the people's lawyer who's been imprisoned for doing her job and defending her clients. And Edward Snowden, another hero, is on the run for telling the people of this country that the United States government, the National Security Agency, the most expensive U.S. government agency, is spying on pretty much everybody in the world. Meanwhile, John Boots on the Ground Kerry, the 2004 so-called anti-war candidate who complained Bush hadn't sent enough troops to Iraq, has virtually taken up residence in the Arab world, working hands-on with the royal families, the royal tyrants of Saudi Arabia and Jordan and the Gulf, the Arabian Gulf, to bring Washington's version of democracy to Syria. Yesterday he was in Qatar, where the Saudi Arabia just engineered a coup, forcing the emir to resign in favor of his even worse son, which the Syrian National Council called a pioneering event. The Syrian National Council is the U.S.-supported opposition leaders. The king giving the power to his prince is a pioneering blow for democracy. Before that, he was in Egypt, where President Morsi had actually taken a less belligerent position on Syria, and Kerry showed up, and now, right after that, Morsi broke relations with Syria, which he hasn't done with Israel. We can see Kerry's version of freedom in not only in the reign of terror going on in the so-called liberated areas of Syria, the beheadings and floggings and amputations, but also in the lynchings of Shiites in Egypt a couple of days ago, and in the murder of Lebanese soldiers by Takfiri cleric Sheikh Amir, who is now on the run in the port of Saida. Sheikh Asir, sorry. We can see it in the rain of tear gas and rubber bullets unleashed by Turkey's NATO regime on peaceful protesters, and in the daily terror by Israeli soldiers and U.S.-born settlers on the West Bank, and in the continued bombing of Gaza and blockade of Gaza imposed by U.S.-made weapons in the hands of the Israeli state. The prime agents in this democratic crusade are some of the very forces the U.S. government has used to justify the police state they're trying to impose here. The same forces who ripped apart the resistance movement in Iraq by turning it into a sectarian conflict. I'm referring to the Saudi-paid and funded so-called jihadists. Sectarian war across the region is what Washington wants. It is what Israel wants. It's what the Pentagon wants. They want not only the Syrian soldiers and Syrian nationalists to die, they want the young people who were sucked into this so-called jihad to die. Meanwhile, Guantanamo remains open. Mass racial profiling and surveillance and entrapment of Muslims in the United States continues. And there are now U.S. boots on the ground in Jordan, over 1,000 troops, with more coming, and 400 U.S. soldiers are on the way to Egypt. The bankers, the Wall Street, the 1% are champing at the bit for a larger war. The Economist, this week, I wish I'd brought it, it's the mouthpiece of the City of London, the Wall Street of London, has, "Can Iran be stopped?" is the front page, is the cover, and its answer is yes, by invading Syria. The Wall Street Journal has the same line, and so does the Washington Post, the Pentagon's house organ. There, the brother in the back has a copy. So the question is, can Iran be stopped from doing what? I'll get back to that. I was in South Lebanon and in Beirut in 2006, right after the Israeli invasion. Right after the Lebanese People's Resistance, led by Hezbollah, a Shiite-based party, inflicted the first major military defeat on Israel's racist, U.S.-armed, murderous war machine. I saw the terrible destruction inflicted by U.S.-made weapons on Ben Chebail and the many towns in South Lebanon, and I also saw that the resistance could not have won, in the real world could not have won, without the assistance of Syria and Iran. And in fact, Gaza could not have held out without the assistance of Syria and Iran. And in fact, Syria played a key role in helping the first Intifada in Palestine. While we were there, we were heading back to Beirut from South Lebanon. There was the assassination of the Pierre Gemayel, the leader of the Lebanese fascist party, the Phalange. It was a factional fight between him and the Lebanese forces, two right-wing Christian organizations, Christian-based organizations, so-called Christian organizations. And for 3 days, sectarian mobs waving French flags were attacking Syrian workers in Beirut, in central Beirut. And myself and my friends I was there with were about to leave, and I was in a cafe when the TV, Saeed Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, came on the television and said, "I want everybody in Beirut tomorrow morning." And the next morning, from the north, from the east, not from the west, that's the sea, from the south, Shiites, Christians, Sunnis, Kurds, Armenians streamed into Beirut to show support for the resistance and to demand an end, some political reform in Lebanon. And it was just then, at that very moment, when the potential for popular unity on a when a Shiite-led militia had the admiration of the entire Arab and Islamic world, when there was a potential for popular unity on a basis, at a rare moment that it was very hard to find, then the princes of the Hashemite royal family in Jordan and the Saudi family in Arabia and of the Gulf, and the characters like John Negroponte and Robert Abrams from the State Department began talking about the danger, how the Middle East was about to be ripped apart by a sectarian war, and the danger of the Shiite crescent, and it had to be stopped. And right away they began working to implement this sectarian policy, to make this a reality, this grim prediction a reality. It began as with Saudi money flowing to Takfiri groups in Lebanon, like the Sheikh Asrs and Saida. Meanwhile, U.S. weapons began flowing to the internal security forces in Lebanon to build it up as a counterweight to the army. This is controlled by the right-wing U.S.-backed March 14th movement. And as we know from the French foreign minister, the former French foreign minister, Dumas, the British began training commandos to fight against the Syrian government several years ago. And I was back in Lebanon in January 2009 as U.S.-made bombs and missiles were raining down on Gaza. And I was attending a conference representing the IAC at a conference of, along with Sarah, at a conference of hosted by the Lebanese resistance. And a major theme of that conference was South-South unity. There were huge delegations there from Venezuela and from Iran, building an economic network around the world that was independent of the United States. But meanwhile, on the other side, in the March 14th controlled neighborhoods of Beirut, the Saudi flag was flying everywhere. The U.S.-Saudi-Qatari alliance, the same alliance that enticed Iraq to attack Iran in a bloody fratricidal war in which 1 million died, and then they turned on Iraq when the war was over to destroy it. The same alliance that financed this very similar operation the biggest CIA covert operation to date in Afghanistan in the 80s. These are the forces behind the war in Syria. The division in the Arab the division in the Arab world goes back. Really, a division goes back to 1952, the Egyptian Revolution, the Iraqi Revolution, 1956, the Algerian War for Independence, when two blocs came into existence. A nationalist bloc that basically wanted to use its resources to develop the country in the way that Dr. Moussa described in Syria, and those royal families who were willing to turn their countries and all their oil resources into cash cows for Wall Street banks, for the arms contractors, and for the oil companies. That war was fought out in a bloody proxy war in Yemen in the early 60s, and it was the Israeli attack on Syria and Egypt in 1967 that tilted the balance in favor of the royal families by devastating the Egyptian and Syrian economies. So the Saudi monarchs really owe their thrones and their heads to Israel, but they repaid that many times over because there's plenty of Saudi money going into Israel via Wall Street. There are those on the left who say that the Syrian government is not genuinely anti-imperialist, but is, I don't know, I think these folks don't know what anti-imperialism means, or what imperialism means. They say it's just acting out of its material interests. Duh. Yeah. People, states, and classes do act out of their own material interests. But there is a real conflict of material interest between those who would want to develop their own country, develop like the Syrian government, which wants to develop the means of production, the productive forces in Syria, and imperialism, which wants to destroy them. Because imperialism, it's not an abstract word, it's not about hegemony and domination. Imperialism is the rule of monopoly capital, and it's the banks, and it's about destruction. It's about destroying any means of production, any resources, productive forces that they don't own or control. They're not afraid of Iranian nuclear bombs. They're afraid of Iranian oil and gas. They're afraid of a pipeline maybe running through from Iran, through Syria, through Iraq, to Lebanon, so that oil that the U.S., that ExxonMobil doesn't own can come on the world market. And maybe the revenues from that will be reinvested in the region. They're afraid of an Alba-like formation coming into being in the Arab world, in the Islamic world, like it does in Latin America. And it's exactly to prevent the emergence of such an economic zone. They're afraid of a Middle East where they are no longer a player, where they don't matter anymore, their dollars and their guns. That's why they maintain Israel at the crossroads of Asia and Africa, and of Asia and Africa is basically a giant U.S. military base. But there's something even bigger at stake, because for most of us, because this war drive is they're not only threatening war with Iran or in war in Syria, which people may think they can do on the cheap, by mercenaries or whatever, and airplanes and no troops on the ground. They're threatening. Their greed is so great, their drive to destroy is so great, they're risking war with Russia over this. And in fact, this is, if you look at what's happening in Syria today, in the Middle East today, I can't help but thinking of the maneuvers before World War II in Europe. The same economic forces, the different as the government is, the same economic forces that drove Germany, Nazi Germany, into war are pressing on the United States. The need to expand, and this is, the Cold War didn't end when the Soviet Union collapsed, because the United States doesn't want any industrial rivals, capitalist or socialist, in the world. That's the drive of Wall Street. And but there is a force greater than the Pentagon and greater than their hoarded gold, and that's the might of the people. That's the might of the people, which we can see in action not only in the heroic fighters of the Syrian army from all religions, who are standing up to this, who are fighting under incredible hard conditions, and not only in the fighters of Hezbollah who have sacrificed so much. We see it in the people of Turkey, who have shut down the northern front that the U.S., the Pentagon, wanted to use to arm the so-called rebels, the Contras. By the way, Saudi Arabia funded the Nicaraguan Contras in the 70s and 80s at Ronald Reagan's request. In the 1930s, when war was on the horizon in Europe, the people of the world, anyone who stood for justice or freedom, knew they had to stand with the Republic of Spain against fascism, against imperialism, and Syria is the Spain of today in the Middle East. Only this time, so much is at stake, we have to ensure that they shall not pass.